In this critical update, Scott Ritter highlights the devastating effects of the Russian military offensive in Ukraine. From relentless artillery strikes in Zaporizhia to the encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Donetsk, Russia's strategic superiority is becoming undeniable. As key cities like Vuhledar teeter on the brink of collapse and NATO-supplied weapons are destroyed in record numbers, Ukraine's ability to defend its territory is rapidly dwindling. Scott Ritter offers a hard-hitting analysis of the reality on the ground, far from the filtered narratives of the Western media.
General Christopher Cavoli, commander of the United States Armed Forces in Europe and of NATO land forces, said in early 2023 that NATO could not imagine the scale of violence and destruction in this fight. If you say that you can't imagine it, that means that we have no plans to deal with a modern war because we're not anticipating it. But imagine going to war and you're planning on losing 3% a day. A plan is what you imagine is going to happen and how you're going to deal with what you've imagined. But if you're thinking that your attrition rate going into a war is going to be 3% a day and you build your logistical sustainment plan around that attrition rate, when your actual attrition rate might be 60% a day, you no longer have sustainability. Which means NATO cannot fight a war. NATO cannot fight this kind of fight. That's the reality. Our military is not prepared for this kind of fight, but perhaps more importantly, the American people are not prepared for it. Are we prepared to receive 5,000 coffins a day? I don't think we are, but that's what's going to happen if we end up in an all-out war with the Russians in Ukraine.
Good morning and welcome to our latest update on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, where Russia continues to assert its dominance. In this video, we're going to break down the latest developments, from Russia's ongoing advances to the desperate countermeasures from Ukraine and the West. As Mr. Scott Ritter has repeatedly emphasized, the truth about a conflict is a far cry from what's presented by the Western media. Ritter, who was one of the few to expose the West's failures, has made it clear that Russia's strategic superiority is undeniable. Buckle up, because as always, we're bringing you the truth that the mainstream media is hiding from you. First up, let's talk Zaporizhia. The Russians aren't resting on their laurels, they're still pushing forward. Yesterday, they unleashed a relentless artillery bombardment on the city, causing significant damage. Over 25 precision strikes were carried out against strategic locations, hitting everything from supply depots to military communication centers. As Scott Ritter has repeatedly warned, Ukrainian forces here are incapable of mounting an effective defense. Their extended lines are vulnerable to Russian precision strikes, in what Ritter has described as a systematic dismantling of Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And that's not all. Russian forces have extended their control northwards to Nestorinka and Rovodin, two critical areas that were once part of the Ukrainian defense line. The strategic importance of these areas is crucial. With this advance, Russia strengthens its access to the surrounding regions and threatens to cut off Ukrainian reinforcements and supply lines. Meanwhile, the civilian population is fleeing in panic or being evacuated by Ukrainian forces, who seem more concerned with their own survival. According to reports, Russian troops have already advanced 15 kilometers into Ukrainian territory in some areas. Let's take a look at the numbers. The Ukrainian forces have less than 20,000 combat-ready troops in the Zaporizhia region. When you compare that to the over 54,000 Russian troops in the region, it's no wonder we're seeing such a rapid collapse of the Ukrainian defensive lines. Russian forces have deployed over 300 heavy artillery units, 150 tanks, and nearly 100 rocket launcher systems to relentlessly bombard Ukrainian positions, a staggering display of their firepower. What's more, Russian electronic warfare units have managed to disrupt Ukrainian communications in over 80% of the Zaporizhia Oblast. Ukraine is running out of options here. The 20,000 troops they have deployed to the region are clearly outnumbered and outgunned. We know from inside sources that Ukraine has lost over 1,000 pieces of heavy equipment in recent months, including tanks and artillery pieces. The much-touted military aid from the West has done little to help. In fact, Western equipment now accounts for over 70% of Ukrainian losses on the battlefield. Think about that for a moment. billions of dollars in Western aid obliterated in a matter of days. Ukrainian supply lines are also crumbling. In the past 2 weeks alone, over 150 Ukrainian supply trucks have been destroyed, severely disrupting the flow of food, fuel, and ammunition. This is crippling Ukraine's ability to fight on the front lines. Not only are they losing soldiers and equipment, they're losing the infrastructure that keeps them in the fight. Don't go anywhere for the second part of this video, where we'll see how Ukrainian troops are dealing with the immense pressure on the Donetsk front. Their resilience and determination to defend their country, even with tragic losses, highlight the human cost of this conflict. We're going to delve deeper into the reasons behind the devastating losses on the battlefield. All right, let's head south now, where the battle for Donetsk rages on. We're going to take a look at the southern front, where Russian forces have been steadily advancing in Donetsk. In Donetsk, the Russians have gradually expanded their control westward toward Staromlinivka. As Scott Ritter pointed out, this is a prime example of the Russian strategy of attrition. Ritter emphasized the importance of controlling logistics and supply routes, and that's precisely what the Russians are doing here. It may not look like much at first glance, but these small, consistent gains amount to a strategic strangulation of Ukrainian forces. With over 30,000 Russian troops in the region, compared to 15,000 on the Ukrainian side, it's clear who has the upper hand here. This is not some random advance, this is tactical brilliance. By concentrating their forces, the Russians are setting the stage for a large-scale offensive aimed at cutting off Ukrainian supply lines. Ukrainian troops are desperately trying to hold their positions, but with Russian firepower closing in from multiple directions, it's only a matter of time before they lose control of key areas such as Bohwanka and Novomikhailovka. And speaking of cutting off the crucial supply routes Ukraine needs to survive, more than 500 kilometers of supply routes have already been affected by Russian advances. In fact, battlefield reports suggest that Ukrainian units are losing up to 60% of their supplies due to Russian attacks on convoys and depots. This week alone, over 100 supply convoys have been ambushed or destroyed, leading to widespread shortages on the front. And how is Ukraine reacting? They rely on the West's obsolete artillery and armored vehicles, which stand no chance against Russian precision strikes. More than 30 NATO-supplied howitzers have been destroyed this week alone. Yes, you heard right. Minus 30 howitzers. Simple as that. The Ukrainians are trying to salvage what they can. But with the Russians controlling over 60% of the region's airspace, these efforts are increasingly futile. The Ukrainian counteroffensive is a failure, and the figures paint a bleak picture. In the last 2 months alone, Ukraine has lost more than 3,000 soldiers in the Donetsk region, and nearly 5,000 are missing or wounded. It's a catastrophic failure for the Ukrainian army, no matter how much the Western media tries to play it down. And speaking of failed offensives, let's turn our attention to Vuhledar, where the situation for Ukraine is becoming increasingly dire. Vuhledar, where time is quickly running out. Russian forces are closing in on this former Ukrainian stronghold, and it's only a matter of time before it falls completely. Russian forces now control over 40% of the city. Ukrainian troops have been whittled down to less than 3,000 soldiers, mostly inexperienced recruits sent to hold the line. The situation has become so desperate that Ukraine has been forced to send wounded soldiers back to the front lines just to maintain a minimum number of troops. The Russians are unstoppable. Artillery, airstrikes, and even thermobaric weapons have been used to break through Ukrainian defenses. Over 50 Russian airstrikes have been carried out in the past 24 hours, leaving over 500 Ukrainian soldiers dead and 300 wounded. Almost 30% of their remaining troops were wiped out in a single day. This isn't heroism, it's desperation in its purest form. Ukrainian troops are now relying on underground bunkers and tunnels to take shelter from Russian bombardments. But this only delays the inevitable. The Russians have been systematically targeting the underground infrastructure that Ukraine depends on. Tunnels have been bombed, supply routes cut off, and entire bunkers obliterated. We've already seen over 50 airstrikes directed specifically at these tunnels, cutting off escape routes and causing cave-ins. Russian forces are methodically wearing down Ukrainian defenses, and as the casualty count mounts every day, Ukrainian leaders are running out of soldiers willing or able to fight. And once this happens, once Russia has full control of the major logistical hubs and supply lines in the south, Ukraine's southern front will crumble. With over 300 kilometers of territory in this sector already under Russian control, Ukrainian forces will have no choice but to keep retreating westward, abandoning even more critical infrastructure in the process. Alright, let's head north, where Russian air superiority in Kupiansk is proving to be a real game-changer. Kupiansk in the northeast has been a flashpoint as Russian forces consolidate their grip around Makivka and pound key Ukrainian positions inside the city. Ukrainians are taking heavy casualties, and we have video footage of Russian airstrikes obliterating crucial Eurostender strongholds. Over 30 airstrikes have been carried out in the last 48 hours, targeting command posts, ammo depots, and frontline positions. Scott Ritter has repeatedly emphasized that Russian air superiority has been the defining advantage in this conflict, and here we see exactly what he's talking about. Ritter said that Ukraine's failure to establish its own air superiority has left them vulnerable to devastating Russian airstrikes, and the numbers don't lie. In this sector alone, Ukrainian forces have lost over 800 soldiers and 25 armored vehicles in the past week. On top of that, 20 artillery pieces, 12 mortars, and several ammunition depots were reduced to rubble. Ukrainian air defense has been virtually non-existent, with only 3% of their missile systems still operational in the region. Russian drones and aircraft dominate the skies, ensuring that no defensive position is safe for long. The total number of Ukrainian casualties in Kupiansk has surpassed 1,200 in the past week alone. This represents a 10% reduction in Ukrainian forces in this area in just 7 days. Meanwhile, Russian forces continue to strengthen their positions. Over 500 kilometers of Ukrainian territory in the northeast is now under their control. It's not just about gaining ground, it's also about demoralizing the enemy. Ukraine is losing soldiers at a rate it can't sustain long-term. While Russia maintains air superiority, let's take a look at the latest strategic updates in Donetsk, where another major breakthrough is brewing. Back in Donetsk, we're witnessing another brilliant strategic maneuver by Russia. Russian forces have successfully advanced across the railway line near Volyn, securing key defensive positions north around Kryvyi Rih, Krasnoyarsk, and Vuhledar. Over 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers are now effectively surrounded, with no chance of reinforcement or retreat, and Ukrainian troops, once well entrenched, are now exposed. Ukrainian leadership has already begun pulling artillery and armored units from the front lines, knowing that any further action could result in catastrophic losses. We're talking artillery batteries and nearly 50 armored vehicles that have been forced to pull back, leaving their infantry isolated and vulnerable. The trap is closing. Russian artillery has been pounding these areas and cutting off the few Ukrainian escape routes, while Russian ground troops increase the pressure. The question is no longer if Ukraine can hold on, because they can't. The question is, how many more soldiers will Ukraine lose before they're forced to abandon these positions entirely? Ukrainian leadership is facing an impossible choice: risk total annihilation or fall back once again. Speaking of hopeless, let's switch gears and head over to Washington, where the US keeps pouring money into a conflict it can't seem to win. Ah yes, the great savior of the West is pumping billions of taxpayer dollars into Ukraine, only to see it all go down the drain. Just last week, Biden announced a new $8 billion aid package on top of the $113 billion that's already been provided. But what has that accomplished? Over 70% of the weapons supplied by the US have been destroyed or captured by Russian forces, and Ukraine is still losing ground, over 2,000 square kilometers in the last 3 months alone. While the West burns through money, Russia strengthens its alliances with 30,000 Russian and Belarusian troops ready to defend their borders, and China and Brazil remain loyal to Moscow. The West's attempts to isolate Russia are failing miserably. As Scott Ritter points out, this conflict is shifting the balance of global power. Russia is gaining ground, while Ukraine and the West are falling behind. As Ritter put it, this isn't just a war, it's a new world order. If you liked this video, don't hesitate to like, share, and comment. It'll help the channel go from strength to strength.